Thank you. This is working. Okay. So I was thinking, I don't know who read the Nosgard piece in the New York Times about his journey through America. Did everyone? Yeah. So a lot of it was about writing about having to write about it. And I feel in the same predicament today. I was trying to write the introduction talking about our friendship. Carla and I went to high school in Italy together, and then we basically stayed very close best friends throughout the years till now. And I don't know how to write about that, so I just thought we'd tell an anecdote, a little bit of how we met, and see if they contradict or not. My first sighting of Carla was in French class in Rome in the high school. It was an English high school, and it was French level 4, which you only got into if you were really good at French. And all of us spoke Italian, so French was a natural thing for us. Carla walked into class, and I was like, wow, who's this new girl? She must be really good at French. And she started answering some question, and I was like, is that French? But she was smiling and super confident, and I was so taken aback and so jealous of this girl, because I was 16, I didn't know who I was. I used to pretend to be shy, then the next day I was. And this girl was just so wonderfully open, and it's still who she is today, and this book so reflects that. So that was my first sighting of Carla Power. I don't know if you have a memory.
Well, I do. The first day I met you, you tried to persuade me to hitchhike on the back of a Vespa across Rome. We had to get from one place to another. You said, let's just get some guys to take us across on a Vespa. We'll just stand at the side. And I, a good St. Louis girl that I am, was horrified and insisted we walk. So, yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. The next memory I have of Carla went to Yale, and then she got into Oxford. And by then I wasn't jealous. I didn't care. I was just like, all right. And I was living in London on Portobello Street, which was a coup. Like, that was the coolest place to live. And I lived in front of the Electric Cinema. And Carla used to run from Oxford crying and saying, I can't study there. It's a hateful place. And can I stay the weekend? And I'd be like, yes, but you have to go back on Monday because you're the only person who got into Oxford out of all my friends. And so we spent weekends together, and this was in 91. I time it with when Rushdie got the fatwa. That's when our friendship became fully heightened, because it was a very exciting time that time. Like, it wasn't like now it's a very dangerous time, and it's I can't explain it, but then it was almost cool and fun to begin the discussion of, like, it wasn't normal to talk about fatwas, and Rushdie was on our mind. And I remember saying to Carla one day, he got a fatwa for writing fiction, so maybe the fatwa's a fiction. And I thought that was a super cool idea, which a few years ago I met, and I now know Salman Rushdie, and I told him, and he was like, oh my God, the other night he said, I really want to come and see Carla speak, but he's in London. So I don't know if you remember that time and those days in London. Of course you do. But what was that period for you like?
I mean, I just remember it as incredibly shocking, and it was funny because when I asked the sheikh about those days, because it really was, those were the times that the British Muslim community were sort of coming out and articulating themselves as a community for the first time, and protesting against the satanic verses. And when I met the sheikh who I was going to study the Quran with, I asked him how he responded, and he had indeed been asked by many people during those days. He had just come over from India.
He was a young guy in those days.
Yeah, he's just a couple years older than we were, and he was like, he refused to comment on it. He was like, his future employer at Oxford actually was saying, so what do you think of the Rushdie affair? And he was like, nothing. And in saying nothing, he reminded me sort of Cordelia, of like somebody who just refused to enter into the passion play the roles that were sort of set out for him, that he was supposed to be an angry, pious Muslim. And he's like, look, every time we protest, it makes it worse for ourselves. So he does.
It's a really beautiful through line in the book. There's a kind of silence that he encourages. And in that silence, it reminds me of monks who are praying, and it reminds me of a lot of images that I think of as religious. And I feel like the sheikh really promotes that, which I love. And it's so unusual nowadays because it's all about how you should feel and what you should think. But he's not. He's about what you should do. So that's interesting. I need a copy of my book, okay, I've got it. So what I thought, there are certain sections of the book I want to read, and then I want to ask Carla about. Okay, so page 194, it says, using the tools of his own madrasa tradition, the sheikh was working to excavate the Islamic principles of justice underneath custom. I wouldn't call him a feminist, but within his conservative milieu, he waged a powerful campaign for women's rights. He wouldn't call himself a feminist either, just a Muslim who has read the Quran. So my question for Carla is, I love this quote because it's about reading, just reading the Quran. And it makes me proud but curious as to why you sat with a sheikh and chose him as the subject of your book and not, say, Amina Wadud, Asma Barlas, and other feminist pioneers of Islamic thought.
I really wanted this to be, it was about the Quran and about an understanding of Islam, but it also seemed to me, I had started thinking about doing something like this after 9/11, and it took me a while to get around to it, but that, we live in such polarized societies, and the chance to sort of sit and listen to somebody really sit. He had 8-hour Quran classes, so it was a long time. But to sit and really try to understand somebody else who was not like you, I had sort of had this sense sometimes, say as a journalist, that I was allowed to write about Muslims in a kind of binary opposition. Either they were like us, they were moderates, or they were different, which meant usually you had to shorthand it as radical or extremist or so on. And I found myself, when I was writing news stories or working on news stories, there would be, I'd be talking about strong men, despots or dictators or jihadis, or muffled and silent women. And I got kind of frustrated by that. And then I would do feature stories, which tried to redress that balance by showing other facets of Muslim life. And even then that was frustrating, because it was kind of like, I would do stories on halal energy drinks, or, Islamic hedge funds, or, veil designers, or so on. And it reminded me of those celebrity magazines you see in at the checkout in the supermarket, where it's Angelina Jolie buying a latte, they're just like us. And so I would keep sliding back and forth between like and different. And of course the reality is much more textured, and both of those news magazine kind of formulas are not really on the terms of faith. They're secular notions of how you write about stuff, which is basically writing about Muslims as identity, as opposed to writing about something spiritual or a more subtle, textured worldview, which is what I want to say.
Such a good answer, Carla.
I love this
I'm
moment.
so impressed. No, because it's almost like you had to take on his language by sitting with him that long to able to write a book about him that felt more thorough than journalism allows. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, number one. So here I said, this is a great little scene described in the book. It's on page 165. So once working at Oxford Center for Islamic Studies, I'd accidentally walked in on a Pakistani colleague is his name Iftikhar? Iftikhar. While he was praying. Mortified, I turned and quickly left. Shutting the door behind me, later, he brushed away my apologies. That's the difference between us, he said, waving a hand breezily. You Westerners make love in public and pray in private. We Muslims do exactly the reverse. That's one thing. And then this is another part, which is all about equalizing the sexes. So many Westerners think it's Muslims who mark out the difference between gender through segregation and the hijab. At the Sheikh's lecture that day, men and women both had been so modest that the differences between them seemed smudged and muted, so demure that the sexes seemed to blend. But that is exactly it, the Sheikh said, delighted that I had told him this. Uncovering makes more clear who men and women are. And when they cover their differences, they are more like the same. That was another thing. And then the last thing is, Carla writes about visiting the Sheikh's wife at home and his daughters. And it's really interesting because she's heard a lot about them and how outgoing they are and not what you perceive that they're going to be. And when she gets there, the wife is kind of withdrawn and different from what you imagine. And she writes about that. And then she hears that the wife had a migraine that day. And that's why she was behaving that way. And so then she writes later about the wife. And so I found that interesting that as a writer, Carla chose to include an adjustment of a portrayal of someone. So it almost allows your perception to be questioned, which is exactly the issue about Muslims being misrepresented. And I just love that you did that. And so I brought up all those things to just somehow bring up women in Islam and how doing that in the book even showed me that you haven't found the answer yet, but in your search, you're showing us the search, and it's a beautiful technique and writing. But if you want to, I know you had another question in the book about, you know, child marriages and gay rights, and there's so many issues that obviously in these 8 hours every week, the man is so quiet in your book. And he's not one, you can't even just bring up a sentence that sounds too loud, a question. So it must have been really hard to bring up all the urgent matters in your soul. And how you distributed those questions over the year is really interesting. But I thought you could talk about that a bit.
You know, he's quite an extraordinary guy in the sense that at one part, you know, he was raised a village boy in a tiny town in Uttar Pradesh, India, and was so bright that he then made it to a very prestigious madrasa in Lucknow, and from thence was sent by his own professor to Oxford. And he's quiet and extremely, I mean, there are all sorts of virtues that I found out are completely antithetical to how I was raised. I mean, I was a kid who, like every other, you know, privileged, not like every other, but like many other privileged Americans of the 1970s, grew up on the Sesame Street jingle, "The most important person in the world is you. It's you and you, if you only know it," or something. Very, very certain of my own center in the universe, and that, you know, that individualism was the way forward. And to interact over the course of this time with a family who really, really questions this notion. I mean, it's one thing to say blithely, you know, they led a God-centered life, but to really, you know, I remember talking to his daughter, Sumaya, and she was like, oh, you know, this individualism stuff, it starts so early, you know. She's like, you know, my kid is going to kindergarten and they're supposed to do show and tell and say, this is mine. And she's like, nothing is really ours, nothing is really, and you know, suddenly I had this flash of Western civilization before me. Western civilization all built on this sort of ziggurat that begins with kindergarten show and tell of this is mine, you know. I mean, this entire city and is like every other. Is I'm sort of like, how would that work? I mean, not that they're living in monasteries by any means. I mean, they're, all his 6 daughters are going ahead to graduate work and are doing very well. But that is very much a byproduct of
Daughters, I know.
6 daughters. Yeah. It's one of the reasons I think he's so interested in women's rights. But yeah. So
Wow. Yeah. Okay, so we're moving on to, it's titled My Favorite Sentence in the Book. So it's chapter 11. This chapter is about when you went to the airport, Heathrow, to meet with the sheikh and fellow travelers, pilgrims going off to on Umrah or the visit to Mecca. And Carla hoped to go to Medina to meet them and to watch. The sheikh was giving lectures, I guess, but you found out it was only Muslim and you couldn't even go that far.
Yeah. I mean, there were two things. There were two. It's not only, that's exactly right. I mean, it was only Muslims, but also, I later found out that I couldn't go unless my husband
Anthony,
came with me as a mahram, as a I think I pronounced that right, as a sort of guardian of me, because and there were young women on the trip who had paid for their non-religious brothers to go so they could chaperone them to. So
that
anyway.
all that the women, how the women find their male companions so beautifully, that whole section. But what I love about this chapter is it just reminds me of any traveling group. If you watch anyone traveling through Europe or wherever, and so it says the pilgrims travel light, at least on the way out. Many were planning to bring home water from Mecca's famous Zamzam spring. A 10-liter drum of water counted as half their baggage allowance. Sumaya swears by the water's nutritional properties and its ability to clear pimples. Instructions for pre-departure: eat light, fruit and yogurt, suit a hot climate. And if you encounter trials on the trip, don't complain to anyone other than Allah. Don't backbite, be nice. Like any good tour bus, and what I love about, again, that wasn't my favorite sentence, I'm going to read that now. What I like about your whole description of the trip to Mecca is it makes me feel I could go on it. And it made me sad that I can't. But I've never seen that described so normally. So anyway, this is my favorite 194. The multi-faith prayer room in Terminal 5 of London Heathrow's airport was sandwiched between a cappuccino bar and the check-in from British Airways. I just love that sentence. Okay, so moving on. What is the time check, just to make sure, because I want to, how are we doing? Okay. Oh, my God. Okay. There's one area of the book that and it's throughout, but I find amazing and moving, is the beautiful anecdotes about Muhammad, both the man and the prophet. He's written as a man who was told by Angel Gabriel to read, and though he was so terrified because he wasn't a reader, the more the angel embraced and relaxed him, he began to speak words that crowded his head. The prophet was a man who was orphaned young, raised by his grandfather, grew up into a striking man with dark, intense eyes and long hair that he wore in 2 braids. He was a simple shepherd, a man with natural gravitas. Later in conversation with the sheikh, he says, when Muhammad met Jesus, he was struck by the sight of a man as handsome as you can imagine being. The sheikh said casually, as if he were recounting a celebrity sighting, medium height with reddish complexion, like people from Syria or Lebanon. Jesus had shiny shoulder-length hair, which he shook with pearls of, as though they were pearls of water and he was coming out of a bath, said the sheikh. So I was so blown away. These are 2 descriptions of people that we don't really have a real idea about. I mean, my idea of Jesus, I'm not sure if he has blue eyes, black hair and a beard, or if he's, I don't know. Muhammad, I'm scared to even think about what he looks like in this day and age. And so I just commend you on making them so personal, these descriptions, and it makes me think these should be read to kids in school, and how did the sheikh, the sheikh talks about Muhammad like it's his friend.
Very much. It's a really, that the words and deeds of the Prophet Muhammad very much, along with the Quran, are sort of the bedrock of how many pious Muslims understand the way to live in the world. And talking to the sheikh about Muhammad, you're right. It was immediate. It was visceral. I mean, he would tell, anecdotes, and the words and deeds of the Prophet have been gathered. And I cannot imagine that there is a better recorded life by someone in the 7th century. I mean, it's debatable. There are lots of scholars who debate over which hadith or words or deeds of the Prophet are sound, which are you toss out because there was an unreliable narrator or not. But the Prophet is very, very much alive in the daily activities of many pious Muslims, and the sheikh, he would sort of, he'll say, it makes your life so easy. You have guests. They come over. You don't know which one to serve first. You serve the one first that the Prophet served first. And it's very much, in many ways,
makes life easy.
Yeah, it makes life easy. Not that, but then again, he would switch back after you think, it's not a robotic sort of thing. It's
right.
It's more just a sense that this is an embodiment of Quranic values that one can look to as a humanizing embodiment of the mores that are in the very complicated and sometimes obtuse language of the Quran.
I think you should go around speaking about this more, because even the way you speak is so different from the Carla I knew a few years ago. There's something in even the way there's a holy pausing in the words that you choose, and I think it just shows that you spent that long with this man. You know what I mean? It's beautiful.
Oh, dear.
I just want to end on, there's so much, but we don't really have time. Well, there's one thing, and there's Sarah Harbert from Newsweek is here, so she'd appreciate this. Carla talks about Edward Said, who's a post-colonial critic that she and I were obsessed with. She got to meet him at Columbia. I used to stalk him post-Columbia. But anyway, he writes in his book Orientalism, a quote from Karl Marx, they cannot represent themselves, so they must be represented. This is Carla's quote. In my first week at Newsweek in 1995, I was sent to write a story on tensions between Christians and Muslims in inner city Philadelphia. When I got there, I found a peaceful coexistence and reported accordingly. But right after we went to press, I found myself pleading with an editor not to run the headline screaming the piece as Jihad in the City. To his credit, the headline was changed. And I watched Sarah Harbert, who's in the audience, have to fight this all the time. So the thing I'd like to close on is throughout the book, Carla talks about her parents. Her dad was this amazing professor of law, right? Very tall, lanky man who I was very scared of. I was scared of his brain, and I was so silent. He probably thought I was nothing. I couldn't barely talk around him. And they lived in St. Louis, and he used to escape St. Louis every summer, and whenever he could, to do a fellowship and live abroad. And Carla says he found his first potent antidepressant in Islamic culture. The slower rhythm of the days, punctuated by cups of tea and the call to prayer, it soothed him. Compared to St. Louis, a city of curt nods to the neighbors, of gas pumped in surly silence, of long walks hunched in the winter cold. Then thinking about her mom, I remember her as an academic who was super nurturing, who encouraged her children to delve into literature as if they were skateboards or Barbie dolls. The passage in the book about Carla's mom passing is one of the... And I chose not to read it because I love them both so much. It's one of the best writings in the book, I think. And I realized that if ever I needed, I would go to that to deal with death. So when you read the book, it is truly of another. It's of the gods. And so it's interesting because the book, although is about this conversation with the sheikh about Islam, Carla's parents gave birth to her, and they're in this so strongly. And I'm so glad to be here for only that reason, to introduce that fact. So let's open it up to questions, I guess. Oh, Maria. Oh my gosh. Hello, this is my daughter, Maria.
After you finished reading the book, what was your first thought about it?
Wow, that's a good question. Like immediately after?
Yeah.
I kind of thought my friend is going to become a rock star. I know Islam isn't like, but I think nowadays probably that is, yeah, I think that's what I thought. I thought I've got the coolest friend in the world. Yeah. Sarah Harbert.
My question is for Carla. This was clearly a spiritual journey for you into the life of a very spiritual person. Living in America, this is not a very spiritual place, where it's sort of the antithesis of that as a capitalist and society. We're about acquisition and consumption. How much of your experience with the Islamic spiritual experience differed from the Judeo-Christian or any other Buddhist experience?
I mean, the thing that struck me as amazing watching how the Quran shaped the Sheikh's worldview is that it is not confined to church on Sunday or synagogue on Friday and Saturday. It is very much throughout the week. He returns to prayer 35 times a week at least, and would pray through the night. So it's this notion of this containing. I mean, we had, when we had our first Quran lesson, the two of us, and we met in this cafe in Oxford called the Nosebag, and it was the least spiritual place known to man. I mean, there were, ladies, little gray-tinted ladies on the left of us, talking about what they were going to give their kids for Christmas, and there were grad students on the right of us gossiping. And he saw absolutely no problem with, opening the Quran and tackling the first surah, the first chapter right there and then, because it's a continuum. It's as the Prophet Muhammad said, the whole world is a mosque. And I was kind of embarrassed, and I was kind of like, are these people going to think, this is kind of crazy? But for him, it's spirituality is sown throughout the whole world, and I'm sure it is in different ways for Buddhists or Jews. But I think watching him be very, very conscious, and the fact that 35 times a week it's a very physical activity. It's going back and pressing your head to the floor and connecting with your God, and that break from daily life is I think extremely important. And refusing to let daily life be cordoned off from it. So does that kind of answer?
Yes.
Or begin to?
Anyone that's living a spiritual life would be humble periodically through the day to reconnect with their spirituality. I don't think American culture is a spiritual culture. So my question was, if you're with someone that's living a spiritual life, maybe it's somebody, I think of a Buddhist monk, or somebody that is living that experience. How different is that from the Islamic?
I've never
describing the Islamic experience as the spiritual place.
I mean, there are a lot of people who would argue that I mean, I remember, one professor saying there's not that much spirituality in Islam. It's practical, and that is not stressed as much as in other religions. I think that's debatable. I'm very suspicious of anybody who talks about Islam as a monolithic entity in any way. I don't know, honestly, because I've never hung out with anybody else who was spiritual in any other religion. So I'm going to have to sidestep your question a little bit. But I mean, it's not as though he's not cracking jokes on the side and very practical and worrying about driving his daughters to school and so on. So I think the way spirituality is laced through intensely practical, ordinary lives. He certainly didn't believe in cutting himself off from the people who were following him or anything. He would wear, he came to work in jeans, or he really, indeed, in following the Prophet's example, he didn't want to stick out from the crowd. He didn't want to. The Prophet wore very ordinary clothes, and whereas other sheikhs in other parts of Britain would often wear robes and thobes and all sorts of stuff, he would, he'd wear khakis and an Oxford cloth shirt, sort of thing. So, yeah.
It's a very profound question you asked, and I think it gets us into this whole question of moral frameworks and spiritual frameworks, because America, as part of Enlightenment culture, with all of its positive and negative, has strong frameworks, values, those that actually shaped Carla and actually brought her into trying to understand otherness. Okay, I'm not getting a sense of whether the sheikh, although he could be very himself in the nosebag, was not able to just ignore the other rather than embrace it in the way Carla was doing it. So I got to tell you, in this, I'm wondering whose morality is stronger.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, and Mark, of course, is very familiar with museums. So it's interesting because at the end of our studies together, we had a lesson in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in part because I had found a tile that sort of riffs slightly on a Quranic surah, the surah of Yusuf. It's a tile of Yusuf and Zuleika, which is a poem, but it takes a Quranic story and puts it in. And even though I knew many Muslims aren't necessarily going to embrace figurative art, I wanted to know whether he would ever be a little bit curious about, just a little bit curious about my way of life, the way I was curious about his. And, throughout our time together, he'd been incredibly generous and polite, but there wasn't, he would ask about the kids and their health and so on, but there wasn't a real sense of wanting to know about coming from a secular humanist background. And so we went to the museum, and we're sitting there and we're talking about, we're talking about various things. And we walk straight past a Michelangelo, and he doesn't look to the left and he doesn't look to the right. And we're sitting there on a couch, and I sort of finally said, well, I was hoping that he would. And when I put it to him, he said, in the gentlest way possible, basically, look, I'm here, aren't I? I mean, his answer was, you would not believe what the guys back at the madrasa in Lucknow would think of me now. And all I'm sitting with a Jewish American journalist in the middle of a museum, and his basic point was, look, I'm here, aren't I? Which is, and we were talking about sex and death and nail polish and jihad and everything under the sun. And which made me realize, of course, that in the conversation, in the dialogue, in his really never having sideswiped, trying to answer my question the best, he was engaging in the best form of secular, my notion of secular education. And ironically, he let me see something. Well, because for me, what's holy is connecting with the other. Like, I don't, that to me, reaching across divides is the greatest thing that we can do on this earth. And so ironically, he allowed me to practice my faith through kind of not, had he suddenly been overwhelmed by, the Fra Angelico in the corner, it kind of wouldn't have worked. He would no longer have, in a way, our conversation would no longer have meant anything. He wouldn't have been the other anymore in that sense, other. And I use that term in inverted commas. So he stuck to his guns and I stuck to mine.
It takes you back to actually your first question, which is why did you study with somebody who was so different?
Right.
Well, that was kind of my question but in terms of, you were moved to write the book or to explore Islam after 9/11. And I'm wondering how the process of writing the book and spending all that time with the sheikh really changed your views or informed you about Islam to the extent that you are now, wondering how the book will relate to hopefully the masses and how, is there any hope for understanding across the divides between, Muslim and Jews and all the Christianity and all the different, polarizing religious beliefs today?
Yeah, no, I am really, and it seems crazy, after a really horrific fall where extremist violence has sort of dominated the headlines, whether it's Charlie Hebdo or the so-called Islamic State. But I think as long as we listen to these quiet voices, these voices who are not news, who are not blowing things up, there's real hope for traction and so on. It's funny. There's so much the sheikh, in many ways has a sort of proper kind of quietist Episcopalian or a notion of a private faith that it's about the individual and God. He thinks these people who are he thinks, those who are screaming for a caliphate or for Sharia law or, mandating that women should wear veils or, loathe the West, he thinks they're absolutely ridiculous in many ways.
It's also beautiful in the book. You mentioned that he's like, well, if a school in France says wear the veil. Just shut up and do the praying and don't spend all the time saying, well, no, we can't. It's so amazing. Like, he's almost a time saver.
He is. It's true. He's very suspicious of what he sees as posturing and identity politics among Muslims. He's like one of the few sort of pithy quips that I thought we could put on bumper stickers from the sheikh is, if you have taqwa, you don't need fatwas, which is, taqwa is God consciousness and just being sort of pious in awe and maybe fear of the majesty of God. And fatwas are religious opinions, non-binding, although we all think of them now as death sentences thanks to the Rushdie affair. But I think the irony is he is a much more traditional Islamic scholar than all these folks that we read about in the news pages who are saying, who are claiming to be taking us all back to, the 7th century. Those guys are working out of a very modernist Western framework, whereas the sheikh, who came out of a traditional madrasa arena and studied and debated and read Aristotle and parsed Arabic grammar, that's a much more old-fashioned, established Islamic tradition than these groups that are making land grabs.
That's why there aren't more voices, more, moderate, not moderate.
Yeah, no, I know.
But people who are clearly nonviolent, is there an outrage from his perspective? Those that are using the name of Islam, in this way?
He's very non-judgmental in that sense. I mean, yes, he's very saddened by people wrapping themselves in the mantle of piety. He's like, they just want what the West wants. You know what all these political groups are doing? They want it. They've been hurt for centuries by imperialism and by the fact that they feel their own societies are declining. And so suddenly now they've taken Islamic language and, cherry-picked a few texts and are trying to tell Westernized Muslims, you too can have, power and land and headlines in the New York Times, sort of thing. So I think he's he's saddened, but he's quietly. I mean, I've seen him face off against some. Against, we went to an auditorium and he was lecturing on Sharia and jihad, and the auditorium was absolutely packed. This was in East London, because usually he speaks about, piety and quiet, but here he was going to finally address political issues. And it was packed with some really quite a group called Hizb Tahrir, which is not jihadi, but they certainly are calling for a caliphate. They're not violent, but they definitely want to see Sharia law enacted. These are, and traditionally in Britain, they had been a lot of angry young guys. So the auditorium was packed with these guys in leather jackets, all of whom were there in the audience to kind of come back at this quietist, apolitical sheikh. And he faced them down, and it was really, it was incredibly tense for the first half of the day. And after lunch, he's like, yeah, they're packing the auditorium. And after at the end, a couple even came up to him and said, you kind of might change my thinking. So I am hopeful that...
Also in that, where you write about that, what's interesting is the sheikh has literature on his side because of the Quran, and I feel like it's such a great weapon,
But see, they have, the scary thing is that they, whoever they are, the Quran is so difficult to understand, and it's so easy to rip things from context.
But he has such a vast knowledge that when they rip things from context, you always show him retrieving anything that he's able to combat them. Whereas they only have the one they ripped. I feel like
he's
amazing.
Yeah,
he's an amazing rapper in that sense. It's the true word,
No, but
it's so modern in my.
But see that it is true, and I think that that's one of the great tragedies for those of us in the media in the audience is that the people who are the extremists have figured out clever ways to stay in the headlines, and the quietists who and the subtler people, or the people who know about Islam as a flexible system that can accommodate pluralism and all sorts of other good stuff that they haven't found the same compelling narrative that the extremists have. They've figured out, they figured out how to do it, and quietists it doesn't make for a sexy story.
It does, though. I truly believe like a girl in the nose bag with the sheik is a great beginning for the film. I think. So we just have to figure out who plays you.
Awesome. Well, we are unfortunately out of time for this evening's program. Carla and Sarita, thank you so much for joining us tonight on behalf of the Strand.